This is a text-to-speech presentation. The original one was in Hungarian language. The text-to-speech software was from imtranslator.com.
My name is András Nagy. If there is somebody I haven't met, I am the lead developer of our product called TRMT at the company. The essence of the presentations today will be, I think, what the IT leaders of Raiffeisen Bank will say about TRMT, about their experiences. I would like to introduce this briefly in 20 minutes, mostly to position TRMT generally in the processes of an IT organization, and then I will turn the proceedings over to the presenters of Raiffeisen. Just one sentence about what TRMT itself is. This is a software release management tool that targets primarily SOA environments. Resulting from this, it puts a high emphasis on the connections between components forming the environment, on exploring and monitoring these. I have entitled my presentation Regulated Software Lifecycle. It's worth dwelling on these few thoughts. By regulated, we wanted to highlight that this tool supports the implementation of release management and related processes in the organization, so that they are done not in an ad hoc way but in a planned, traceable, and controlled way. The second element is obvious. The tool targets the release management of software. So the products of these processes are software that are functioning, comply with the provisions made for them, and they can be operated afterwards in a functioning environment. Finally, I considered it important to include the word lifecycle into the title of the presentation. I wanted to refer with this to the fact that the tool provides tool support, respectively automation possibilities for the different phases of the entire software development lifecycle. This picture introduces the regulated process topic. I think one of the most fundamental values in the 21st century is efficiency. This is obviously positive in certain areas, it may be negative in certain areas, but the custom-made, manufactured production technology, that is based on the existence of unique, well-trained craftsmen who produce unique products based on unique processes, is gradually disappearing. This obviously has its beauties, so for example the products produced with such manufactured technology are all unique, but this is typically not what an IT organization targets in the software development area. Instead, they try to increase the efficiency by having standardized processes with as much automation as possible, building on as much reusability as possible. So generally this branch moves toward an industry like, we can say, production technology. This is where this description of software factory model originates from. This isn't new either. It appeared in 1969 at Hitachi. So the essence of it is, to introduce, as in other processes, industry-like behavior into the software development, production, testing, operation processes, with more planning, higher efficiency, faster cycles. What is needed for implementing this in a software development process? On the one hand, a methodology is needed that describes how these processes have to be organized and efficiently operated, and a tool support is needed that enables the execution of these. We think that this is where TRMT for SOA helps in an IT organization. It helps regulate, automate, and document these processes, and that's what I'd like to briefly talk about on the following slides. So the first topic would be the regulation as one of the essential topics of the software factory model. What does it mean in this context? Obviously it means that there are rules and standards to be followed, frameworks to comply. Well, I have written a few examples for these, respectively. It means what technologies TRMT supports behind these. I will not read them. You will be able to download the presentation later. Regulation also means that we unambiguously define and separate from each other the responsibilities that different roles have in these processes. So TRMT defines the tasks that are unambiguously related to development, operations, quality assurance, release planning, and testing responsibilities, and strives for separating these with limits. The presenters invited from Raiffeisen Bank also came from different areas: quality assurance, operations, development. I think this will be perceptible from the presentations. The next element of this regulation topic is managing and enforcing permissions. So it is very important that everybody in the process has permissions using which she can execute the tasks belonging to her area of responsibility. I would like to use the opportunity to refer to the fact that we have solved this in a rule-based way, built on our other product TCPS that will be also covered today. Finally, as a summary, in this context TRMT has the objective to enable the enforcement of these regulations by supporting standards, respectively by being able to fit into individual organizations, to the already existing old processes and systems established for these. Raiffeisen Bank is a good example for this. The next essential element of this model is automation, and its advantages are obvious. Typically efficiency is higher, reliability is higher, possibilities for error are decreasing, the ability to plan is increasing. Obviously the costs and execution times of an automated process are easier to plan than those of a manual process carrying insecurities in itself. The repeatability of processes is realized, so a deployment tested in the test environment is expected to be able to be repeated by automation in the production environment as well. So these are roughly the advantages that we can connect to automation. I have highlighted a few examples related to TRMT for SOA for areas where the tool helps through automation. The first that I mentioned was exploring the dependencies based on the source code. This is something that we consider to be a fundamental differentiating characteristic of the tool. So here we talk about the fact that TRMT explores the connections between components forming the environment, for example in the SOA environment having many connections, by analyzing the source code. I have listed the standards related to this and supported by TRMT. Another such possibility for automation is for example the build and the deployment, that is automating the release rollout with scripts, respectively different integration tasks where TRMT creates connections to different other systems forming part of the environment. I will talk about this later. The next element of this model is the importance of documentation. Documentation is obviously important. Procedures have to be documented in order to have regulation, or to enforce the rules. Traceability is important from the audit point of view. Here the real objective of TRMT is that the supported process should document itself. So each step of the process, for example when we deploy into an environment or hand over some modification to a release, it should leave some trace in this process so that it is retrievable, auditable later. Respectively, the other part of documentation is the maintenance of registries. Typically it would be very difficult to implement it manually, without tool support. For example in the SOA environment having many connections we think it would be impossible to manually maintain a registry about which exact version of which service is used by which client, therefore this is one of the main scopes of the tool. However, this way it is easy to answer from the registry maintained by TRMT questions like for example which clients actually use a service interface version. If this is deprecated for a year now, can we terminate it, or are there still any clients that rely on this? Another example I brought here is the automation of requirements registration. So starting from where the requirements will result in changes in the releases through this controlled release management process, the documentation of these is realized, so it can be retrieved later which release corresponded to which requirements, what changes it contains, or which release corresponds to a specific requirement. Closing this topic, my next few slides are about how the release management process and particularly TRMT fit into an existing IT environment. Obviously the release management itself is not an isolated process. I've listed here a few processes that are familiar from ITIL: incident management process, change management, configuration management process. I'd just like to talk briefly about how TRMT helps the implementation of these processes defined by ITIL, respectively the requirements connected to these. And obviously from the fitting point of view, the fitting to a development environment established at an IT organization is interesting. So the first such process I mentioned was the connection with the incident management process. A certain part of these processes is covered by TRMT itself at some level, but at the same time it provides the possibility that if an organization already has established processes for handling these, or even actual systems for supporting these, then it should be able to adapt to that. In case of incident management, incidents arrive from the users during the daily practice, and can turn out about them that they are bug reports, so they relate to bugs, or to new capabilities. These have to result in changes somewhere in the applications, so they have to be channeled somewhere into the release management process. TRMT supports the integration with such incident management systems. It can take over the incidents in a certain phase as requirements, so those become part of the release planning process. These requirements can be specified as conditions for generating a certain release, and TRMT will provide information back into the source systems about the changes of these requirements that occurred in TRMT, that is in the release management process. We have to think about the following. For example, a bug report is recorded in a Bugzilla for a system, and something will need to be changed in the application to correct this. At the point where it turns out this is really a bug, TRMT takes over this requirement. The release manager specifies in which development process, in which release this needs to be implemented. The issue management system is already notified about this, so it gets back a notification that the requirements implementation is planned and in which release. Then when the finalization of this requirement is performed in each affected component of the system to be modified, and thus a consistent status is achieved again, then TRMT signals back to the original system the completion of this requirement. Another process I mentioned is the change management process. Obviously, the modification of a software product, the deployment into an environment, and the configuration in a given environment do have as a consequence a change in the environment status. The provisions of the change management process refer to these, so that these are implemented in a planned way, using standard processes following standard procedures. TRMT can provide tool support in this area as well through the fact that it serves as the connection point to these managed environments. So if, for example, a deployment to an application server, to a portal server, to ESB is performed in a scripted way through TRMT, then the change management process itself is also performed channeled into a standard process, in a logged way, so auto-documenting itself. Another interesting point I mentioned here is the monitoring of changes in the parameters of environments. This is a new capability of TRMT. It is about the fact that each application has configuration elements that are specific for the given environment. So for example, if a service is called by 3 client applications in an environment, there is always a question, when these configuration element, like the accessibility of the service, username or password are changed, what other elements are affected by this change in the environment? TRMT offers a solution for this. Respectively, I have highlighted here from the regulation perspective 2 control points that are interesting from a change management point of view. When the modifications get into the release, these are connected to certain conditions, so TRMT prescribes certain conditions that the modified code has to fulfill in order to be handed over. Respectively, it is possible to specify individual handover conditions, for example a handover protocol that the organization uses to control its own development processes. Another such control point can be, for example, the checking and approval of deployment scripts that we have implemented in the course of this year based on a request from Raiffeisen Bank. This relates to the fact that through this approval point a designated role, for example a designated quality assurance role, can review and accept that the deployment scripts are compliant with the organization's own internal provisions. So there is a possibility to implement such a control point here. The last such notion defined by ITIL that I mentioned here is the configuration management process, respectively its connection with the release management. Generally, this process is about the registration and management of the descriptive data of components forming an IT environment, respectively the connections existing between them. The tool covers a part of this by having a historical registration about which releases were running when and in which environment. It registers descriptors that are needed for configuring the given component in the given environment. Deployment scripts also refer to these descriptors when they deploy respectively configure the application for a particular environment. It is important to mention here the registration of connections between components as an essential function of the configuration management, and the CMDB, that is Configuration Management Database related to it. In TRMT this is based on the automated exploration and monitoring of connections. So, as I mentioned, this means that TRMT explores the connections that are established between these software components by analyzing the source codes of managed applications. And it's worth mentioning here the possibility of an external CMDB connection. TRMT is not primarily a CMDB tool, so if there is an established process in the organization for it, then it might be relevant to connect to it. For example, at Raiffeisen Bank this is realized with the IBM WebSphere Service Registry and Repository tool that can be regarded as a CMDB database of services. I'd just like to highlight that it is generally formulated as a success criteria related to CMDBs how they are capable of exploring and monitoring the information they store about the description of components, respectively their connections. TRMT also ensures this through the integration with the service registry, in a way that it passes to the registry information about the reality explored and continuously monitored by it, ensuring by this that it always stays in sync with the reality. I've already mentioned with regards to the fitting into the existing environment the fitting to development environment, respectively. I've listed here a few technologies and tools that are supported by TRMT. Eclipse is a popular development tool and we have a TRMT plug-in for it. I've listed two tools typically used for Build, Ant and Maven, the usage of which is supported by the tool. Respectively, I put here the continuous integration as a principle or model, and two tools with which we've used TRMT successfully. Specifically in case of Hudson for example, Raiffeisen Bank utilizes in parallel a tool managed by TRMT as a pilot project. I just wanted to mention this as an example to suggest that the scope of the two areas is somewhat different. Continuous integration would mean that in a development process where typically more than one participant is affected, and anybody can ruin the other's work, it is useful to have a tool that ensures that these problems, through which developers can give each other a hard time, surface as early as possible. Through the automatic execution of build when performing each individual change, the unit tests are automatically running. Practically this is similar, it also ensures a kind of consistency but its scope is different. TRMT helps to achieve a consistent status of the release as quickly as possible. And this is my final slide. It explains what we consider as essential in a new environment in relation with the implementation of release management based on TRMT for SOA. I think the most essential consideration about this is that we put high emphasis on implementation and on continuous support, regarding both the methodology and the tool. Respectively, we consider it important to fit the process and the tool into the local environment. How this was realized at Raiffeisen Bank will be related in the following presentations.